It's the Bluebloods coming back at you guys with another huge episode today. We're joined by a very special guest today on the podcast, guys. It's the voice of the Kentucky Wildcats, Mr. Tom Leach. He's with us today to talk all things Kentucky football. And we just want to say we appreciate you joining us today, Tom.
Happy to do it. This current circumstances, there's not a whole lot else going on.
Right. And so I want to start by looking at last season, of course, for the Wildcats. And I think to say injuries changed the season for them would be an understatement here. But the program ended off with a great, for me, a spectacular win over Virginia Tech in the Belk Bowl. What were your biggest takeaways from last season, and how big was that last win in the bowl game to cap the season?
Yeah, it was the kind of the signature win that they really needed to make it a memorable season. I think, given the circumstances, what they did was amazing to reinvent themselves. But they had just come up short against Tennessee, one of their big rivals. They played really well at Georgia, but came up a little short there. And so those were a couple of opportunities for a real signature win. They beat Louisville pretty handily, but Louisville's was coming out of a down period, I think. So I think they needed the bowl win to have kind of something to hang their hat on for the season beyond just some nice numbers. And so to get the win the way that they did, coming from behind, was a nice cherry on top of the sundae for the season.
Right. And, we talked about how they overcome some very, circumstances they did not foresee. But I want to stick with last year and shift to one of the more impressive players. He actually was my bowl season MVP, and that's Lynn Bowden Jr. I mean, he started at quarterback, not his normal position, throughout the second half of the season. What made Bowden so special and dynamic? And did his willingness to put his comfort aside for the team really rally this team throughout the season?
Yeah, I think you probably hit on something there. I think he was very much, a team guy in the way he approached it. He could have said that, he was hurting his draft stock by moving from receiver or, risking greater injury, et cetera. And he was he was lobbying to do the quarterback role. And I think as far as his skill set, really bright. I mean, he had to manage a lot. People look at it and say, well, he just ran the same play every time, or everybody knew what was coming. Well, it's looking at it very simplistically, because they did a lot of different formations. Yeah, they ran some of the same plays, but out of a lot of different looks, which is what enabled them to be as successful as they were. But Lynn had to manage that from the quarterback position and make sure guys were lined up correctly, start guys in motion at the right time, make the right reads. And then I think his vision must be incredible. He was just outstanding at, making cuts and just in an open space. He was kind of like a point guard running a fast break a lot of times, it felt like.
Yeah, absolutely. And last year, through this adversity that Zach mentioned just a few moments ago, this team seemed to stick together really well, and they rose above that adversity. Outside of Bowden, was there a player that kind of stepped up and shined that maybe surprised you, or maybe somebody that a lot of Kentucky fans wouldn't have thought, would stick up and be I don't know how to say this, like the backbone of this team?
Yeah, I don't know if there was any one guy like Lynn, but I think maybe groups, the secondary, for example. Kentucky finished in the top 5 in the nation in pass defense, and the secondary was a big question mark. They had lost several guys to the NFL, had a lot of new faces, lost one of their best players, Devontae Robinson, on the back end of the defense to an injury in preseason. And so that was a big question mark, and those guys, I think, far exceeded what expectations were. So they did a good job of not letting teams get home run plays against them, because they had lost, a guy like Josh Allen up front as well, and Josh Paschal was coming off an injury. So I think the secondary, just as a group, no one individual. And the offensive line, I think, was expected to be a strength, and if anything, they even were better than expected. So running back was kind of a committee thing, but I would say start, probably the secondary as a group, and then maybe the offensive line was the other key.
Right. And so now I kind of want to shift to the head of the program, Coach Mark Stoops. I mean, he's really taken this program to new heights. I mean, even won the SEC Head Coach of the Year award in 2018. What makes Stoops such a perfect fit in Lexington, and what do you think his keys to success are for this program?
Well, when he came, there was talk that he had a very detailed plan that he presented in his job interview with Mitch Barnhart, the AD. And so it was clearly a job that he had thought a lot about, and that, he wanted the job as much as Kentucky wanted him, which I think certainly is a good situation to have it that way from the school's perspective. The other thing with Mark is he probably is uniquely qualified to be in this position at Kentucky, because Kentucky doesn't produce the number of Division I prospects that the other states in the SEC do. They get, Florida and Texas, and then probably Georgia's next, are just massive amounts, hundreds upon hundreds of D1 prospects, and Kentucky's maybe fewer than 50. I don't know what the exact numbers are, but it's there's just not usually enough. If you just dominated the state, it still wouldn't be enough Division I talent. But if you look at a map and you draw a line around Kentucky and then include Ohio, the state of Ohio, well, then with some of the large metropolitan areas you have in Ohio and the population base, then you look at the number of Division I prospects that are produced by the state of Ohio and add that to Kentucky, then you have a competitive number. And Ohio State can only get 25. They may get the top 25, but they can only get 25. Well, Stoops has been able to do that. He's from Youngstown. His best friend he brought with him is his chief recruiter, Vince Marrow, who's also the tight ends coach. And Vince is a tremendous recruiter, also from Ohio. So, they have effectively made Kentucky's base the states of Kentucky and Ohio. And so that gives them, a base that allows them to compete. And then they've had success. So now they've been able to build on that base and carve out some success recruiting-wise in other areas. And that was kind of a unique set of circumstances for these particular guys and this particular staff, head coach in particular, and this job.
Yeah, for sure. And like I said, yes, Coach Stoops really did lead Kentucky to this big influx in recruiting, maybe around the states, maybe not specifically in Kentucky. But not only that, I feel like he's done a lot for the program in just winning. I mean, he led Kentucky to their first win against Florida since 1986 and their first win in Gainesville since 1979. How big was this win for the program, do you think? And do you think it was a huge turning point for this program?
Yeah, it was a massive win. I think they were already turning, but it was just something that, it was an embarrassing streak to have not beaten Florida in such a long time. So to get that record off the books was like an albatross hanging around their neck that they got to remove. Eased a lot of, I think, pressure that players and coaches didn't have to hear about the streak all the time after they finally beat the Gators. And plus came on the heels of a game the year before that they really gave away where they should have won against Florida. So that was it was certainly, you can make the case, the biggest win of the Stoops era. But I think things started to turn really in 2016 when they qualified for the first bowl in the stretch that they've been in now. But yeah, the win in Florida was massive, just to get that streak off the books and then to kind of I think propel them on to the 10-win season that they had, which hadn't been done here since the late 70s.
Right. And so I kind of want to shift to next season, and you address some recruiting and getting players to come to Kentucky. And I want to address one of the biggest moves of the all season, because I'm dying to know the perspective of someone from Lexington and the hype around the city. I mean, Joey Gatewood comes in, transferring from Auburn, and this hits home for me. I'm an Auburn graduate. I was really high on Gatewood when he committed to Auburn and was really upset when he decided to leave. I mean, how big was this for Kentucky to get Gatewood on campus, and what are your first impressions of Gatewood and what he's going to bring to the Wildcats?
Well, he's a tremendous, physical specimen. Big young man. Looks, doesn't look like your typical quarterback. Looks like he might be more like a tight end or an outside linebacker. But I think for Kentucky at the moment, the biggest quarterback issue is the health of Terry Wilson, the incumbent, because he's coming off a knee injury, and I think the coaches certainly felt was poised to have a big year last season, and was cut short early by an injury. So he just recently tweeted out that he's 100% healthy now, and I think that's the biggest quarterback topic here. And then there's a local kid whose dad played at Kentucky. The young man's name's Bo Allen. And so anytime there's an in-state kid, that creates a lot of buzz. So, it's kind of equal parts Gatewood and Allen as far as, the buzz factor. I think is really, as I said, more interest in Wilson in terms of any quarterback conversation, just because he's coming off an injury and he's the guy that's expected to be the starter. But
yeah, for sure.
I think if all goes well, Wilson plays this year, does well, and then Gatewood and Allen compete for the job, and Gatewood would have certainly more experience, and then you'd have maybe a situation where Gatewood could take the job. I would think would have a chance to have it for a couple of years, and then could maybe Allen redshirts this year, plays behind Gatewood for a year, and then takes over. So it's a lot of if down 3 or 4 years down the road, but they finally have a kind of a nice pecking order there set up at quarterback seemingly.
Right. And speaking about that, actually, I'm sorry, I'll go ahead and move on, actually. So, to talk about next season, Bowden Jr. and some other big names are now off to the NFL. Do you think you could give us and some of our listeners some names to look out for in the coming seasons?
Quentin Bohanna is one that comes to mind, nose guard that earned a starting job over some veterans as a true freshman. Has battled a few injury issues. If he stays healthy, I think he's capable of having an all-SEC caliber year. Won't get a lot of sacks because he plays on the nose, but if he's as good as I think he will be, then he will create sack opportunities for other players, one of them being Boogie Watson. If you look at his numbers, they're kind of similar to this point to what Josh Allen's were through his junior season. Now, Boogie's got to take on the challenge of elevating his game the same way Josh did, but I think there's a high expectation that Boogie Watson could be a much more prominent player on the defense. Offensively, it's not the glamour position, the offensive line, but that's really where their strength lies. They have arguably one of the top 2 or 3 offensive lines, I think, in the SEC. I was talking with Cole Kubelik on my radio show today, who's former offensive lineman at Auburn and an SEC network analyst now, and he thinks Drake Jackson is it's either him or the center at Oklahoma as the best in the nation. So, Drake's certainly a name to watch, but he won't carry the ball, won't catch the ball. So, if you are just the casual fan, you won't see him show up in the stats. But Drake and those other guys that will join him on that offensive line will be a big part of the success that I think Kentucky could have this season.
Right, and you talk about some success Kentucky may have. I mean, next season, this team has some huge road games. I mean, against opponents who have a little bit of hype surrounding them, such as Florida, Auburn, Louisville, Tennessee. What game, even if it's not one of these, are you circling on the Wildcat schedule to be the biggest, or let's just say the most important game of the season for this team?
Well, the Kentucky fans, I think, believe that their team is capable of competing for the East title, and I think the players certainly believe that. Coaches do. with all the experience that they have, and especially in these challenging circumstances, having a roster with a lot of experience, I think, is going to be very helpful. And having a veteran coaching staff and some continuity on the staff, all that are factors that Kentucky has going for it that I think will serve it well in these times that we're going through with the virus and all. So all that being said, you'd have to say Florida if you aspire to win the East, because you could get a big upper hand in that race early if you were to win at Florida. Now, not many people at the moment are going to give them much chance to do that. So you could, and you could still get to Atlanta without doing that, but it certainly becomes much more challenging. So, if you're talking from that perspective, which is, I think, the perspective that the players want to be talking from, you'd have to say Florida, and then as far as the road games, and then Tennessee and Louisville. Louisville's a in-state rival. There's you want to continue to control that series, which they have done in recent years. And Tennessee is a series in which they need to get more wins. Frankly, they have been in a position where it was there for the taking several times in the last 5, 6, 7 years, and they haven't took it nearly often enough. And so, if you want to talk about moving up in the SEC, it's time to take care of business there. And Vols are getting a lot of buzz and a lot more than Kentucky is. So if you want to get that respect, you have to go out on the field and earn it by winning a game like that, especially on the road. And the road could be a lot less challenging if there's not many fans in the stands. So we still don't know how that's going to play out.
Yeah, you're right about that. So moving on, to talk about next season a little bit more. What are your expectations for this Kentucky team? What do you think their ceiling is? And I'm sure you don't want to talk about the floor too much, but what could be the possible floor?
Well, I think I think they're at a stage where I'd be surprised if they didn't win 7, say, as far as a floor. And then as far as a ceiling, I think it's legitimate to think they could contend for the East title. So they probably, couldn't take certainly any more than 2 losses to have even a prayer at that, and likely 1. So, if they want to do that, you're probably going to have to, win 10 or 11 to be a contender to get to Atlanta. And, that's a big ask. It's not something Kentucky's done. So I think it's possible with all the experience they have. A lot depends on how well Terry is coming back from this injury. If he is healthy, then I think that gives him a big boost. So that's at the upper end of the spectrum. Somewhere in between there is probably the realistic version, but I don't think it's a pipe dream to think that they could make a run to it on Atlanta. So that's kind of the range I think that you're looking at.
Yeah, I mean, I think Kentucky's going to compete more than most people would believe, but I kind of want to shift into your time as the voice of the Kentucky Wildcats, your time calling these games. I mean, you've been involved with the network since, the late 80s, early 90s. And so, I mean, you've been the voice since I believe 1997. What has been your favorite memory and or game that you've ever called in your career?
For Kentucky football, I think it would probably be that Citrus Bowl game couple of seasons ago where they achieved a 10th victory, which hadn't been done since 1977. Did it in a New Year's Day bowl game, beating Penn State, which was favored. And one of the touchdowns, deciding touchdowns, came from one of the star players, Benny Snell, and on the touchdown run, he set the all-time school rushing record. So there's a lot of good factors there for the broadcaster of a particular team to have converge together in a given game. The next one probably would be in when Rich Brooks was here and had it going at the highest level. They beat number 1 LSU in 3 overtimes. So just a tremendously tense, exciting game. that you love as a broadcaster when you have so many big plays made in a game. And then the first year I was doing Kentucky football in '97, they beat Alabama. Tim Couch was the quarterback here for the first time in 75 years. So those would probably be the three top games on my list for football in that order.
Yeah, I definitely remember that LSU game. I was in Baton Rouge and big Tigers fan. But can you speak a little bit on the environment of Kroger Field and the atmosphere of Lexington on game day? I mean, what makes it so special, and why do you think it's one of the more underrated environments in SEC?
When Kentucky has it going well, it is, I think, can be an intimidating environment. Now, it has been sporadic in terms of having it going well over the years, but Stoops is on a good roll right now. I think back to a couple of years ago when Georgia came in to play, in November with the Eastern Division title on the line. If Kentucky won that game, they would have had the tiebreaker over Georgia and would have been in a position to get to Atlanta for the first time. And it was just an electricity in the city all week long, and that went to the highest level on game day all throughout the day. That LSU game was incredible. So there's a great passion for Kentucky football here. It just hasn't been rewarded all that often over the years. And I know there are a lot of longtime Kentucky fans, people that I've worked with and around, that believe that the passion could be every bit as strong for football as it is for basketball if the success happens for football.
Right. And I mean, I'll never forget the year Benny Snell was competing. There were some great environments just based on what I saw on TV at Kroger Field. And I mean, you've called a lot of games in your career. You've been all over the country calling games for at probably every SEC stadium at this point. So, I mean, outside of Kentucky, what's SEC environment is your favorite and why?
I like Georgia. I think probably the best. A little of that is selfish in that as a broadcaster, our vantage point at Sanford Stadium is between the two decks, whereas at places like Florida and Tennessee, we're up at the top. And so much, much higher up. So you have a flatter, closer to the field vantage point. So that's just from a selfish perspective as a broadcaster. But the stadium's right in the heart of campus. So you get that quintessential college football Saturday feel there. A lot of great traditions at Georgia. There's the kind of bridge up over the lower bowl in one of the end zones where students and fans will gather and can watch. And it's right in the heart of campus, and it's a great college town. So I think that's a lot of reasons. That's the one I would put at the top of the list. And people there are always very nice. Of course, they're used to winning over Kentucky, so maybe that's why they're always really nice, because they expect to win. But I think in all seriousness, they're just wonderful folks, and so it's always a pleasant trip, and just not too many victories for Kentucky over the years.
Yeah, absolutely. So I have to ask, you hear a lot of sports fans, they'll call Kentucky a basketball school. And I think that's mostly rung true in the past. But I think tides are being turned. I think the football program's really, when I say they've made an upturn, I think that's an understatement. You mentioned earlier, they're now contending for a spot in the SEC championship, really. So what do you see in the future for this program in terms of success, and could you see Kentucky being a legitimate contender in NCAA football? I'm talking about playoff implications here. And what do you think that'll take to bring them there?
Well, if you win the SEC, you're a playoff contender. So that goes hand in hand. But the real question for Kentucky is, I think they can certainly do it. Once they were, playing for it 2 years ago against Georgia. If they've been able to win the game, they have been there playing in the championship game. And if you win that, you're in the playoff. But the question is, can they do it year in and year out, and that's still to be determined. I always looked at it. Didn't want to put a ceiling on what I thought Kentucky could do, because they'd never been able to find the right guy to make a significant climb beyond a certain level. Rich Brooks got awfully close, but I always thought that for Kentucky, it's kind of like in a battle fighting for a piece of ground, say on a hill. You get to a spot and then you have to hold that spot. So for Kentucky, that's, getting ahead of some of their SEC East rivals. And so consistently being at least in the middle of the pack of the SEC. And I think they're there now. Then you've got to beat Tennessee more regularly. You've got to win your share against Florida. You got to beat Georgia once in a while, and, occasionally get to Atlanta. And then if you can do that, can you then do that with some level of consistency? And that's still, those latter things are still to be determined. But I think that's kind of how you have to look at it. You have to get to a higher spot on the ladder and then be able to hold on to it in this league. And that's, very difficult. Missouri won a couple of division titles when they first came in, and then they've regressed. They weren't able to stay there. So it's a lot easier said than done. But biggest chore is recruiting, and they're making a lot of headway there. But still, they're not getting, the quantity of talent that, Alabama, say, and Georgia do, but they've significantly closed the gap. Can they close it a great deal more? We'll have to see. That's what it'll take.
Right. And as we approach 30 minutes here, we got one last question for you. And I felt like we had to honor one of the best ever suit up for the Kentucky Wildcats. I wish we could have had you on, more recently. But I mean, you've seen some outstanding players in your time as the voice of the Kentucky Wildcats. And I want to ask you about one individual who did mean a lot to the Lexington community, and Jared Lorenzen. I mean, after his career was over, he returned to the Kentucky Sports Network. And I just want, just to end the show off, I wanted to honor his legacy. And just, could you speak on his impact on the community and why he was beloved by so many in Lexington and across the just entire football community?
There's so many reasons. He had a bigger than life personality. A great guy to know. Just a great, friend, if you were a friend of his, to have as a friend. Amazingly talented, gifted, athletically, great athleticism, which people will look at his body type and scoff at that, but tremendous agility with his feet, had an incredibly strong arm. He was the kind of guy, and a couple of coaches, when Coach Morris first came in, and I think maybe even when Coach Brooks first got here, I think they both looked at Jared and thought, well, he's he's not getting himself in the kind of shape that we want him to be in. He can't be our leader as our quarterback, and they would try to go to another direction. And Jared would always find his way back, because his way to lead was when he walked in the huddle, his teammates thought they were better. He was going to make a play. He was going to do something. He just had that quality that great talents have, to inspire that kind of confidence in their teammates, and then to have the ability to do it, to make the plays. His best season was really when he was in his best shape in 2002, and unfortunately Kentucky was on probation. They won 7 games, and it probably should have been 8 or 9. His first year, he started as a redshirt freshman, and they kind of threw him into the fire. And then Coach Mumme lost his job after Jared's first year. If Coach Mumme had been able to stay around, Jared would have put up numbers that nobody would ever catch, I think, in the SEC in terms of passing. But whatever Jared was asked to do, he did it. He was always a great teammate. So just so many things to like about him. And he was a Kentucky kid, so that endeared him to the Kentucky fans as well. He loved the state, loved the school, and just made so many incredible plays that he was kind of like a, bigger than life character. And it was such a shame to lose him so early.
Yeah, for sure. And I know it's a tough topic to talk about, so I definitely appreciate you sharing your thoughts on that and everything. I know I
Yeah,
wanted to bring it to our listeners.
It's actually, it's sad that he, especially for his family, that we lost him so young. But in terms of reminiscing about him, there are so many good memories that Jared provided people that it's, I think you can't help but have a smile come to your face when you talk about Jared.
Right, for sure. I know how much he meant to everyone who he interacted with, especially throughout his football career, especially at Kentucky. So I definitely appreciate that. But that is a wrap on this interview, guys. I just want to personally say thank you so much. Thank you so much for joining us, Tom. And we definitely look forward to having you in the future, especially if we can get a season in this year. Maybe it might be spring, but definitely in the future, we look forward to having you back on.
Well, enjoyed it, and hopefully they'll make it to Atlanta one of these days. That would be a big story, certainly around these parts and throughout the SEC. So we'd have plenty to talk about then.
That's for sure. I'll be rooting for you guys. My team's in the West, so I can root for Kentucky endlessly, and I do not like Georgia, so we can definitely do that. But guys, we will be back next week with more episodes, and we'll get in touch with you guys about that. You guys know the social media, all that kind of stuff. So until then, guys, we are out.